Okay, so I want to now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Bruce Fein. He's been in D.C. for 45 years. He served as Deputy Attorney General. He served as the General Counsel for the Federal Communications Commission. He was counsel to the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran. He was the leader of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Presidential Signing Statements. He drafted articles of impeachment against 4 presidents, Nixon, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And he's testified before Congress on more than 100 occasions. Mr. Bruce Fein.
Well, thank you for attending this important session. As Henry V said before Agincourt, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Now, our task, I think, is more challenging than the one that confronted Henry V. But before we get into the details, I want to warn the audience that all of the effusions that hosts make towards speakers are not made under oath. So you need to put that calculation in. The issue that we have, seems to me, to address first is what is mankind? What distinguishes the human species from other animal species? And of course, the issue is obvious for anyone who has devoted even 10 seconds to watching Snooki or Honey Boo Boo, because that asks you, are we at the Cro-Magnon stage of Darwinian reverse evolution or something of that sort? My definition of mankind that distinguishes the species from any other is the thrill of the search for truth without ulterior motives. And I'll repeat that. It's the search for truth without ulterior motives. And truth here is not like searching for Newton's laws of motion, but truth in determining what between ashes to ashes and dust to dust is virtue. What makes life worth living? What gives it dignity? What we could call tolerance, acknowledgement and honoring due process, restraining our ambition to dominate others, to satisfy our appetites, as opposed to living an adult existence where virtue and knowledge and restraint are the summum bonum of life, not wealth, sex, money, domination, power, creature comforts. So in my sense, is the critical question that confronts mankind is, have we forfeited a characterization of being men and women as opposed to subhuman species that craves and thrills at killing other members of the species, or animals that devotes most of their time to envying those like Lady Gaga or Mike Tyson and wretches that are icons in the popular culture. Remember, this is not a new question. Mark Twain wrote over a century ago, the main difference between a dog and a man is that if you rescue a dog and feed it, it does not bite your hand. So, and moreover, I think it's misplaced to think that the challenge of maintaining mankind's human element, as opposed to permitting it to surrender to the appetites, is at all novel to this generation. I take you back to Ecclesiastes. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And I think all of our investigations alert us to the fact that the DNA in the species has remained unaltered from the beginning of time. It knows no geographic boundaries, it knows no religious boundaries, it knows no gender boundaries or gender orientation boundaries. And so this quest that, in my judgment, is the essence of life, to subordinate the appetites to the higher virtues of wisdom, knowledge, and restraint, are ones that have confronted every generation from the beginning. Now, in terms of full disclosure, I think to give you an alert to my background, I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my first acquaintance with the outside world was with Lexington and Concord, Old North Bridge, Paul Revere's Ride, William Longfellow's, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, was the 17th of April in 75, and barely a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year." I've never played or wanted to examine a video game. I've never smoked marijuana, taken wine. I get a thrill out of reading Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord Bridge. "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world." That is my disclosure. That gives me thrill. And the guiding force in my life, and what I suggest is the answer to whether we can save mankind, was really reading at a very early age the trial of Socrates, where he subordinated life itself to defending the idea of a free mind, searching for truth, what is virtue, what is moral and what is not, by taking the hemlock as opposed to confessing and yielding that defense of freedom. That is what, to my mind, is thrilling. That is the high water mark of life. As opposed to today, you walk around Washington, D.C., it's not unique to the capital of the United States and elsewhere. Who are the people that are celebrated and honored on the statues? Lafayette Park, across from where President Obama sits in the White House. They're who? Warriors, right? People who have achieved fame by killing other people. You won't find Rodin's The Thinker, any place displayed in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. If we read back to the Greek-Trojan War, what were they fighting over? Not morality, they're fighting over a woman, Helen of Troy. That drove the conflict. And the persons who are celebrated, and the heroes, even the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hector, Odysseus, Agamemnon, these are warriors. Achilles, these are warriors. Nestor is sort of the background. The thinker is not given respect, it's not given honor amongst all these other heroic figures who earn pedestals. And that, in my judgment, is the greatest danger to mankind. Because if a species is thrilled out of dominating and killing others, it does not have a long shelf life. And this problem has existed from the moment mankind began to traipse around the world. And you can read it in the Old Testament, the New Testament. I've read 20,000 books, every political history in the beginning of time, and the narrative always is the same. You have a culture, because of the DNA, that instinctively is thrilled. The kinds of chemistry, the kinds of excitement that we are hardwired for is the excitement that comes out of domination, control. Go to the moon, climb mountains, kill somebody, dominate others. We have to be big. We have to look at the whole world as, well, we can't let anything happen without our ability to control or manipulate it. And that example occurs more prominently in countries that have empire status, the ability, because of military power, to intervene elsewhere with relative impunity. It's less pronounced in places that are tiny and don't have the ability to coerce and dominate others. And that's why at the outset of the United States, when we were a small country, 13 states, we didn't have huge military, maybe 6 frigates. The British had 845, were sailing all around the world and fighting wars everywhere like we are today, the Boer War, the 3 Afghan wars, the wars in Burma and elsewhere, that we displayed, in my judgment, a proper humility. The fighting creed was the one announced by John Quincy Adams, 6th president, but then Secretary of State in 1821, and is addressed to Congress. We do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. The glory of a republic is liberty. The glory of an empire is domination and control. And he said we could become, if we wished, the dictatress of the world, but our policy then would migrate from a policy of freedom to a policy of domination and conflict. And he thought that would be the end of the American experiment, why we could be different than other nations through separation of powers. And today, that idea, of course, has been lost. Even the killing of Osama bin Laden, you have ghoulish cheers like we had won a football game at the Super Bowl or something. Not that Osama bin Laden is someone who should be emulated, but it's a tragedy, not a source of celebration, that man can turn into such an evil creature. And also with a failure to even ask the question, have we done anything that has provoked this kind of terrible, horrible, repugnant response? Maybe we are provoking other people to react because we have troops in 180 countries, 200,000 troops stationed abroad, and we intervene wherever we wish. We promulgate the doctrine that might makes right. Therefore, if we wish to use a predator drone to target anyone for assassination, even our own citizens, we can do it in secret. We can do it with accountability. We can play judge, jury, prosecutor, executioner, and that satisfies due process. In our eyes, it may, or in the White House, but nowhere else in the world is that viewed as a satisfaction of due process of law. And now, why does that matter? Why will our flouting of due process of law so insouciantly create a threat to mankind? In the history of civilization, due process has been the most important single idea, dominating everything else, including Newton's laws of motion, the force of gravity, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, all the physical understandings of the universe. Because due process is the first time that the human species has recognized, I could be wrong. I need to listen to the other side. That's what due process is about. Events are multidimensional, not unidimensional. Other people may see them differently. We need an impartial decision maker to decide how to resolve competing ambitions and tensions. We can't trust ourselves with a conflict of interest. That humility, I could be wrong. The most important idea in the history of mankind, because it's the fanaticism that believes, oh, the world is all prime colors. There's no chiaroscuro, no grayness. That's what leads to combat and fighting. People simply believe that they have ultimately discovered the truth, and anyone who disagrees then is the enemy. Instead of thinking, no, in mankind, we're all in it together. Remember John Donne? Do not send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. We are all part of mankind. We want everyone to be a winner. We want to divide up the world into geographic boundaries, into sex, into sexes, and wish that some are subordinated and some are superior. We want everyone to win, everyone to have a fair chance in life, everyone to enjoy justice and due process of law. We don't gloat. We don't taunt people because they've fallen down or they have born into circumstances that are less advantaged than our own. And this idea among the species that we're all tribes, and it's like I say, the metaphors that are used, that was spoken of, metaphors, the metaphors of a game, football game in the United States, the blue team and the red team, the quarterback or the linebacker. Is this where kids playing in a sandbox and deciding whose castle gets to survive the other ones? That's infantile, juvenile thinking that the species should grow out of at about age 12, just before the teenagers. And now people age 50, 60, 70 still revel in this idea that politics and life is like a game. No, it isn't. It's higher if it's to have any more meaning than simply survival for the sake of survival. And so when we ask what is needed to save mankind, it's not a question of whether or not the species can survive in the sense that we have respiratory functions. It's not extinct in the sense that the dinosaurs became extinct. We still have the species that looks like human beings. But if it doesn't move and be motivated by the adult virtues of knowledge, wisdom, and restraint, it isn't mankind anymore. The name may remain the same, but the substance has been removed of all meaning. And I think that as we examine our own lives, the destiny of the species, the destiny of the country, it's wrong to believe that there is some kind of endpoint, there's some kind of problem, there's some kind of single, if you will, silver bullet that will solve the miseries, the deficiencies, infirmities, ailments, pathologies of mankind. Because in my judgment that the entire exercise is one where process is more important. The process is the result. It's the way in which we look at life itself. How we treat other people with dignity, thoughtfulness, standing up for our principles, disagreeing but not being disagreeable, treasuring due process, having certain things that we will fight and die for, including self-defense. They go against fundamental principles, but largely recognizing we could be wrong. Our way of life may be not quite as agreeable to others as it is to ourselves. We permit other people then to go their separate ways. The spirit of charity, forgiveness, self-criticism and restraint. We could be wrong. Not the kind of arrogance and sanctimony that we see every day in the United States more prominently than elsewhere, because we can get away with it without the feedback or the deterrence that other countries that are smaller could not. And it's that process of life which is the heart and soul of mankind. Do you remember the famous words of Hamlet, Shakespeare? What is a man if the chief good and market of his time is but to feed and sleep? A beast no more, surely God gave us reason not to fuss in us unused. And that's perhaps Shakespeare's most famous play. And he's asking there, well, what is the purpose of our time on earth before we go to our afterlife? And that, it seems to me, is what mankind is all about. Now, how then do we at least ameliorate what we can see in our daily lives, all the huge subtractions, what I would call the suboptimal lives that the masses exist and live and thrive and thrill in? You know, Thoreau wrote in Walden, the masses of people live lives of quiet desperation. I'm not sure they're lives of quiet desperation, but I do think you all in this audience and we at the podium here have an obligation as leaders to try to encourage and inculcate in those, the large majority who I think by nature are inclined more to follow their appetites than be thrilled by Socrates taking the hemlock to defend freedom of the mind. By leadership and example and living lives that are irreproachable to extract or excite the better angels of their nature so that they can join and raise this country to its republican status that it enjoyed at the outset, despite its many deficiencies. And here I want to examine one of, I view, the paradoxes, if you will, of certainly the United States and some other countries that now I describe as acephalous, leaderless, non-leader leaders. And that is, as I examine the audience today, in some respects it represents a triumph of the idea of equality, far superior to that existed in 1776 when the shot was fired, heard around the world. Because people of different color here, we're all equal, people of different genders are here. That wasn't true. The time 1776, we held a meeting like this, it'd all be white male, probably Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the room. Others would be viewed in some kind of subjugated status. And the idea of the equality under the law has made enormous strides from centuries ago. It made enormous strides despite the fact that at the outset of the quest, it looked as daunting as someone standing at the foot of Mount Everest and saying, my gosh, it's a long way up. Will I ever get there? Boston, near Cambridge, Massachusetts, was the place where William Lloyd Garrison in 1831 began his Liberator magazine. Now, Mr. Garrison was called an abolitionist. That was an extremist position then, because all of the economic forces and the political forces were in favor of slavery, at least certainly in the South. It wasn't going to be eliminated. He maligned slavery as a covenant with hell. And initially he was tarred and feathered and driven out of Boston, but he persisted. And I don't need to recite every step along the way, but the last publication of the Liberator was in 1865, and the 13th Amendment, which you may be acquainted with if you've watched the movie Lincoln, was ratified and eliminated slavery. But I can tell you, when he began, he was ridiculed as a hopeless dreamer. You'll never get there, Mr. Garrison. And for you women in the audience, you may recall 1848, Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others. We really need to get the vote. It was something that Abigail Adams had urged on John early on when the Declaration of Independence was under consideration, but it was with futility at the time. And it was almost 70 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified that enfranchised women. And along the way, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for the audacious crime of seeking to vote. My, what a challenge that was to orthodoxy. And similarly, the initial quest to end religious persecutions began when it looked totally and completely futile, and many lost their lives at the stake, Bruno being one, but only one of those who perished in the quest for religious toleration. So we cannot be daunted by what is obvious to all of us who have not been sleeping like Ichabod Crane, that we confront a crisis, like all generations, as to vindicating our identity as human beings, not as animals and savages who find thrills in satisfying and gratifying our appetites in instinctive quest for domination and control and creature comforts. So what does that mean? It seems to me we have to get away in the United States from this idea of the superfluity of leaders in order to lead mankind away from the precipice of destruction. We don't have a long shelf life in train if we don't change, because the ability to destroy ourselves is much more potent today than it was at the outset, where slaughters were limited simply by the primitive nature of the weapons, whereas today a crazed, fanatical political system that keeps people at the top who crave domination can destroy the whole world very quickly. We in the United States have this paradox. As these commendable things occurred in the destroying of those elements or vestiges of a caste that kept women, certain religious or ethnic, racial groups in subjugation, and we now have a much more equal society under the law than ever before. We have also developed what I call a culture of the lowest common denominator, which is thoroughly expectable, because ideas and talent generally is rallied to those places that are the source of economic wealth and political power. And we have a lowest, then, in order to obtain wealth and political power today, it's generally viewed as a very prescient to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And without wanting to sound elitist, which is viewed as something of a curse word today, like the N-word, even though Thomas Jefferson centuries ago could speak of an aristocracy of merit and not be laughed at, he used the word aristocracy today. Oh my gosh, this is somebody who wants to take us back to pre-biblical times. But the fact is, and it's a truth that it can be extrapolated from observing all political societies for 4,000 years, that there are only a relative few outside the bell-shaped curve who have that talent of leadership to appeal to the better angels of our nature. But today, because we have such a egalitarian culture, there's an implicit, if not even a subconscious belief that, well, wisdom and correctness will emerge by spontaneous combustion from the majority. Like the majority could vote what the speed of light is, or the majority could vote on, Newtonian physics. But that's simply wrong. Simply because a majority believes in something or insists on something probably is a good earmark that it is wrong. At one time, the majority believed in witches, the Salem witch trials. For centuries, the majority believed in the geocentric theory of the universe, and Galileo went to house arrest because he had the audacity to suggest that was wrong. But today, the majoritarian culture brings to the fore people who appeal and seek to gratify the idea, well, listen, I'm a hockey mom, I'm Joe the plumber, I'm just like you, so you should elect me to office. I don't really need to know anything. In fact, it's dangerous to know anything. Ask Rick Perry. You should get D's, students, That's what we really want. Or Sarah Palin, we don't read newspapers here. We don't, thinking is bad. Only elitists think, Can you imagine that Socrates wouldn't have had a second before, Mr. Perry and Sarah Palin? But they're unfortunately just the tip of the iceberg. I say it's something that pervades our entire political culture, and the need to get a people who will respect and honor leadership for what it is, people who actually would vote for George Washington or would vote for Socrates to be the leader, and recognize that they need tutelage. Not because they're less equal under the law, but again, because the bell-shaped curve. Most people are not equipped to be leaders, to inspire others to follow their highest principles, to get a thrill out of the search for knowledge, truth, without ulterior motives. That's not something that's hardwired into our system. And if you survey the world today, and I suggest it's been true from the outset, and calculate what I call a human misery index, oppression, privations, and otherwise, the vast majority of the human misery index is composed of human beings slaughtering, oppressing, killing, subjugating, intimidating other human beings. A tiny, tiny percentage are tsunamis, and asteroids, and hurricanes, and storms. We don't want to rule them out completely, but they're tiny. And that's what we need to change if we're to rescue mankind. And I say it's not like there'll be an end point where we'll say, aha, we've achieved the promised land, and let's hope we don't have to wait 40 years like Moses. But it is the process and knowledge and struggle. Yes, we may fail in our lifetimes, but that's the only kind of life that's worth living. That's how I want to live, because of what it says about us as a people and we as an individual, about what we will be remembered for. And I want to close by making a reference to Thucydides' speech upon Pericles' death. And he was exhorting people not to believe that the highest and best sepulcher is some Napoleonic mausoleum, some Lenin-like mausoleum that will sit in Red Square forever. He says, the sepulcher we all ought to crave is to live in the lives and hearts forever of those of the living and those yet to be born. And that's what is needed in order to save mankind. That thrill of what life is about needs to be inculcated into children, into teenagers, into adults. And if that is done, my judgment, all the ills of mankind will soon fade. And even with regard to poverty, is what Seneca said. A man who covets more wealth, even if he's Mike Bloomberg, is very poor, right? A man who's satisfied with meager possessions is very rich. That's what King Lear discovered when he lost his kingdom and castles to Goneril and Regan and discovered Cordelia. He became rich as he lost all his possessions. Thank you. I could amplify on that vignette. I had drafted the impeachment resolution for Congressman Jones. And I want to try to explain the background and reason for its urgency. When the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia in 1776, these were people who were erudite. They had examined the history of conflict. And it appeared that it was the executive branch that regularly was leading people into war, whether it was David or otherwise. Because, they concluded, during times of conflict, the executive gets all the power. the taxes, the money, the secrecy, the contracts, the footprints in the sands of time. And therefore, the executive had concocted danger out of thin air in order to justify warfare. Therefore, the members universally and unanimously insisted that only the Congress of the United States, which did not confront a conflict of interest in entering war, would not increase but would have its power diminished in times of war, could vote a war resolution. Only the Congress of the United States. And indeed, the first president, George Washington, who himself presided over the Constitutional Convention, stated, before any president can use the military offensively, Congress must provide a declaration of war. Thomas Jefferson needed 10 statutes to use force against the Barbary pirates who were engaged in an international crime of piracy. Now, what the Founding Fathers believe it was very important to set a very exacting threshold in order to move the country from a state of peace to a state of war. The definition of war, ladies and gentlemen, is it makes what's customarily murder legal. It makes what's customarily murder legal. In other words, you return to a state of nature. As Cicero said, in times of war, the law is silent. It isn't that there can never be occasions that justify war. We couldn't have responded to Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor with indifference. But you need to have very high and exacting standards of provocation to justify war, because you return to a state of nature. Whereas Thomas Hobbes wrote in the Leviathan, life is poor, brutish, nasty, and short. Even for the superpowers, ultimately, who will go the same way of the Roman and all other empires unless they step back from the precipice. Because the Founding Fathers stated repeatedly, freedom and liberty cannot exist in a state of perpetual warfare. Those instruments of authority and power that were initially concocted to fight foreign danger will come back domestically and destroy liberty at home. Ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what has happened since 9/11. We are told at the outset, we must fight them in Kabul. We must fight them 6,000 miles away, or else we will end up fighting them in Washington, D.C. That justified Guantanamo, preventive detention without accusation or trial, unilateral use of force by the president in secrecies, intercepting our phone conversations, emails, and otherwise without warrants. Now, over 10 years later, the last iteration of the National Defense Authorization Act, one of the most vocal proponents of war and belligerency, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, the famous state that shot the Union at Fort Sumter. He said in defending the continuing authority of the president to use not only law enforcement but the military to detain American citizens and to dispatch them to Guantanamo Bay, because they're an ever-present danger to the country if they were somehow associated, whatever that means, with a group associated with Al-Qaeda. He said, ladies and gentlemen in the Senate, we need to bring the battlefield here to the United States. We can't keep it in Kabul. If those terrible people come to the United States, and we know that they could be here, even if they're an embryo, you can't wait for that embryo to grow 60 years later, turn into a mushroom cloud. You need to stop now. You need to exterminate it now. We need to go to lobotomy so they can't learn chemistry and physics to develop these IEDs. We can't be timid, otherwise that mushroom cloud keeps coming up. Right? And that's where we have. Now, what was initially created to capture and detain persons abroad, now right in the United States. And as far as legal architecture goes, the president's claimed authority to employ predator drones against anyone who he decides in secret is an imminent threat. And imminence no longer means soon to happen. It could be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. In other words, it means whatever the president wants it to mean, as he borrows from Humpty Dumpty and Alice in Wonderland, which is where we are. It means he can use the predator drones here, on us, on me, on anyone who says something and he says, well, you're saying something that be sympathetic to the enemy. Wow. That means, ladies and gentlemen, all of our liberties, including our right to life, is not a matter of right. It's the indulgence of the president. He has chosen, for political reasons, not to vaporize us. It's not something that should let you sit with equanimity. Really? That sounds like vassalage rather than citizenry. And even if we have a president who, because of his own moral compass, if that's not a contradiction in terms, would refrain from using predator drones in the United States, think about the principle. It lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for any successor, and sometimes at one point it'll be Caligula, to use at the claim of any need. Is that what our posterity will inherit? Those yet to be born will inherit vassalage and serfdom rather than citizenry. And I think about this daily as to what historians will say about us in this room and elsewhere in the United States. Will they say what Tacitus wrote about Rome as it degenerated from a republic to an empire? The worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, tolerated by all.